Shabbat Shalom. It's wonderful, even on this very windy, rainy, chilly evening, to welcome all of you to Sukkot Shalom, to welcome Shabbat together. For those of you who are joining us online in live stream and our own live stream or Facebook or YouTube, we welcome you on this Shabbat as well. We know that you are, we hope, warm and secure in your homes. We welcome Shabbat together in this sacred place, in this Sukkot Shalom, in this shelter of peace. Let's join our voices together with a nigun, simple, wordless melody.
Please join me in singing. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la.
Welcome Shabbat as we light the candles, adding light to our lives, adding warmth to this evening. On page 2, if you're following along in the prayer book.
Please join me again in singing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat.
So this evening, the music that we will be using at times will be interspersed with some classic pieces of jazz. As many of you know, there's a great connection between Jewish tradition and jazz. Even though jazz grew out of the African American experience, it also became part of the Jewish story as well, whether through klezmer or Benny Goodman or George Gershwin, or the producers and record distributors and the club owners. Jazz and the Jewish community, particularly in Chicago, were so interconnected, and so Kenny will be leading us in special music for this Shabbat.
As part of our Kabbalah Shabbat service, we often include songs of love featuring that word dod, beloved. So we'll begin this evening, as we will hear later about Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and Count Basie, with a Duke Ellington composition, I Let a Song Go Out of My Heart. I let a song go out of my heart. It was the sweetest melody. I know I lost heaven, 'cause you were the song. Since you and I have drifted apart, life doesn't mean a thing to me. Please come back, sweet music. I know I was wrong. Am I too late to make amends? You know that we were meant to be more than just friends, just friends. I let a song go out of my heart. Believe me, darling, when I say I won't know sweet music until you return someday. On page 13 of your prayer books, we offer now Psalms for Kabbalah Shabbat. Sing to God a new song, a song that is in our hearts. Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash. Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash. Sing unto God, all the earth, a new song. I will sing unto God a new song. Sing unto God, and we'll all sing along. All the earth a new song unto God. Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash. Shir chadash. Shir chadash.
Continuing with songs of love for Kabbalah Shabbat.
When I was studying jazz a little bit in college, I studied with a man named Richard Davis, who is a bass player of significant repute, a son of Chicago, and he told me to listen to an album as I was studying voice called The Greatest. Count Basie plays and Joe Williams sings. And on that album was the track by a piece of music by the Gershwins, performed by Count Basie and Joe Williams, titled Love is Here to Stay. And like a lot of music that the Gershwins would have written, it is very closely related to Jewish culture, both the music and the lyrics. So I'll read to you now a bit of scripture, a bit of Isaiah. Chapter 54, verse 10. For the mountains may move, the hills be shaken, but my loyalty shall never move from you, nor my covenant of friendship be shaken, said the Lord, who takes you back in love. And now, from the Gershwins' lyrics to Love is Here to Stay. In time, the Rockies may crumble, Gibraltar may tumble, they're only made of clay, but our love is here to stay. So we'll offer again this song of love as part of our Kabbalah Shabbat service. It's very clear, our love is here to stay, not for a year, but ever and a day. The radio and the telephone and the movies that we know may just be passing fancies, and in time may go. But oh my dear, our love is here to stay. Together we're going a long, long way. In time the Rockies may crumble, Gibraltar may tumble, they're only made of clay, but our love is here to stay.
So with beloved, welcoming the beloved, the Sabbath bride, the Sabbath queen, Lecha Dodi, page 20, and verse 9 on page 21.
Lecha Dodi, likrat kala, penei Shabbat, Kabbalah. Shalom ateret bala, gam besimcha uvtzola, toch emunei yom segula, boi hala, lecha dodi, likrat kala. Kabbalah.
We turn now to Baruch Hu, praising God who's to be praised, praising God who's to be praised now and forever. If you're comfortable standing, either in body or in spirit, on page 28, as praise God.
Yai lai lai, yai lai lai lai, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai. Baruch Hu et Adonai Adonai hamevorach le'olam va'ed.
Page 29 at the top. There is one who sings the song of his own life, finding everything within himself. There is one who leaves the circle of herself and sings the song of her people. There is one whose voice rings with the song of humanity, hoping for the highest perfection. And there is one who rises even higher, uniting with all creatures, with all worlds, filling the universe with song. Nevarech, let us bless as we regard the oneness of the universe, the oneness of the harmonies of music, the oneness of humanity, the oneness of God. Page 34.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. 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 Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
Please be seated.
From Duke Ellington's Black, Brown, and Beige, we offer now these words. Lord, dear Lord above, God Almighty, God of love, please look down and see my people through. Lord, dear Lord above, God Almighty, God of love, please look down and see my people through. I believe that God put sun and moon up in the sky. I don't mind the gray skies, 'cause they're just clouds passing by and by. Lord, dear Lord above, God Almighty, God of love, please look down and see my people through. On page 40, our song of freedom and getting through, Micha Mocha. Yai lai 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 yai lai 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 yai lai 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 yai lai 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 yai lai lai lai. Micha mocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha sefele Mavudecha ra'u vanecha Bokei achiam lifnei Moshe u'Miriam Ze'elianu ve'ameru Ze'elianu ve'ameru Adonai imloch le'olam le'olam va'ed Adonai imloch le'olam le'olam va'ed.
Baruch atah Adonai Ga'al Yisrael. Blessed is the eternal Redeemer of Israel. On page 42 at the bottom, this blessing, thanking God for spreading over us, over all the world, over Jerusalem, a sukkot shalom, a shelter of peace.
Baruch atah Adonai haporei sukkot shalom Shalom aleinu ve'al kol amo Yisrael ve'al Yerushalayim ve'al kol amo ve'al Yerushalayim shalom ve'al Yerushalayim ve'al kol amo ve'al Yerushalayim shalom Baruch atah Adonai haporei sukkot shalom Shalom aleinu ve'al kol amo Yisrael.
We turn to page 46 as we enter the Amidah, the standing prayer, the central prayer, asking God to open our mouths, our lips, that our mouths may declare God's praise. If you're comfortable standing, physically or in spirit, please do as we join together.
Adonai sefatai tiftach ufi agi tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise.
Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, "Prayer invites God's presence to suffuse our spirits, God's will to prevail in our lives. Prayer may not bring water to parched fields, nor mend a broken bridge, nor rebuild a ruined city, but prayer can water an arid soul, mend a broken heart, rebuild a weakened will." Let's take a moment for our own personal prayers, our own thoughts and meditations. When you are completed with your own prayer, have a seat at your own pace.
We offer now this vision of peace, the beloved What a Wonderful World, sung by Louis Armstrong. Please join me in singing. I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them blue for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue, clouds of white, bright blessed day, dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really they saying, I love you. I hear babies cry, watch them grow. They'll learn more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
One of the great places to go if you are in Israel, in Tel Aviv on a Friday night, and the weather is good, and you go down to the Mediterranean, here on the boardwalk, there is a gathering called Beit Tefillah Yisraeli, the synagogue of Israel. And here, looking out at the Mediterranean, they always sing that song in Hebrew as part of the service. We turn to page 253, offering prayers of healing and well-being. Misha Beirach Avotenu Avraham Yitzhak veYaakov, Motenu Sarah Rivka Rachel v'Leah, Hu Yivarech v'Yirapeh et kol hacholim. May the one who blessed our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, our mothers, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah, bless, heal, strengthen, guide those who seek your support, those who seek comfort and healing, those who are healers themselves as well, those we hold in our hearts. Baruch atah Adonai rofeh hacholim. Blessed is the one who heals the sick.
Source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen.
Turning to page 282 for the Aleinu. Again, if you're comfortable rising, we stand.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גאולה ליוצא בראשית, שהוא נוטה שמיים ועושה ארץ, ומושב יקרו בשמיים ממעל, ושכינתו זו בגובה מרומים, ובאלוהינו אין עוד. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא.
On page 287 in the middle of the page.
ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד.
Turning to page 293 in preparation for reading of Mourner's Kaddish. Our thoughts turn to those who have departed this earth, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every race and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. We think of all of our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we have drawn into our hearts with our own. On this Shabbat, we recall especially the beloved memories of those whose yortzites occurred during this time and during this season, those of more recent death of these past 30 days of Shloshim is keenly felt by family and friends and community. We mention all these names with a sense of gratitude, devotion, and abiding love. The memories of Rochelle Grill, Sheldon H. Red Shaps, Ann Gottlieb, David Zissik, David Pollock, Daniel Burke, Joan Tether, Lily Weinstein, Judy Krismanek, Rose Schofer, Ralph Schofer, Morton Light, Jerry Jerome, Nadine Matron Prosperi, Lala Fishman, Billy Kantoff, Leslie S. Pauls, Jr. Zecher Tzadikim Livracha, may the memory of the righteous be an abiding blessing. On page 294, we say together, Yikadal, Yikadash, Shemei Rabbah, Bialma, Divrach, Yerutei, Viamlich Malchutei, B'chayechon uvyomechon, Chayedecho Beit Yisrael, Bagala uvizman kariv imru Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach Leolam Almei Almaya. Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'tadar v'yitalah v'yitalau Shmei D'Kudusha B'richu. Leilam min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata da'miram bi'alma v'imru Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabbah min Shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom b'mramav hu ya'aseh Shalom aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. May the source of peace grant peace to all who mourn, comfort to all who are bereaved. Amen. Please be seated.
Oseh Shalom b'mramav hu ya'aseh Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imeru Amen.
We are delighted on this evening, on this Shabbat, to welcome an old friend of Sukkot Shalom, Larry Tye. Larry has been with us a number of times, but I think this is the first time he has ever been in our sanctuary. Probably imagine that we didn't really own a sanctuary. He's spoken at the Standard Club at lunch. He has spoken as well at the Community Recreation Center for Caffeine for the Brain. But I think this is the first time he has ever been in this sacred space. Larry has been a journalist with the Boston Globe, specializing in medicine. He is a graduate of Brown. He has taught journalism at BU, at Northeastern, and at Tufts, and he has been a Nieman Fellow in addition to many other awards that he has won. I think the first time he spoke to us, he spoke about his book on Superman. He has also written a book on Satchel Paige, on Bobby Kennedy, and on the life of Joe McCarthy, as well as many other of his works. And all of them have been compelling, interesting, dynamic. He has also written a book on homelands, the portraits of the new Jewish diaspora, not America and not Israel, and the life that is, the Jewish life that is happening there. Right now, he is in Chicago, lucky for us, in researching his newest book called The Jazzmen, Duke Ellington, Satchmo, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie. It is a really delight to welcome Larry Tye to Congregation Sukkot Shalom to share with us his insights from this new work that he's now devoted to. Larry, please.
You're very polite. You haven't said that it's pretty strange to be doing a book talk on a book that you haven't written a word of yet. But I always thought that anytime I was out doing book talks on books that I had actually written and that were out and published, I thought, wouldn't it have been wonderful to try out this talk before you wrote anything to see whether anybody's eyes resonate with you? Mr. Tye. Sure. Oh, hold it up. Yes. So you can take your mask off. So I need. It's been so long since I've done a talk live. I had a book released a year ago that was a biography of
a senator from not far from here named Joe McCarthy. And I did 3 times more talks. I probably did 100 talks on that book, but they were all done by Zoom. And the idea of doing a talk live is very exciting. Doing a talk hybrid, which is some combination of people on Zoom and seeing a live audience here, is wonderful. So who cares whether I've written a word on that book or whether I know anything about what the book will really say. But I want to tell you about 3 parts of writing a book. And the first is coming up with the topic that you're going to write on. And my topic is, as the rabbi said, it's called The Jazzmen, How Duke Ellington, Satchmo Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America. And I want to tell you where this idea came from. I wrote a book years ago that I spent a lot of time in Chicago researching it. And it was on the black men who worked on the railroad called Pullman porters. And some of you may have actually ridden on the wonderfully elegant Pullman sleeping cars, but these were the men that George Pullman hired starting just after the era of slavery to work on his sleeping cars where he was going to charge people a fortune for taking them across country, and he needed the ultimate servants. So he hired ex-slaves, and they worked on the sleeping cars, and it turned out to be the best jobs black men could have from the end of the Civil War until the 1960s. And I wrote this book on the Pullman porters, and when I got done with the book, I made 2 promises to the Pullman porters. And there were, at the time I was writing the book, about 50 of them who were alive in America. A year later, when the book came out, there were 25 of them alive, and sadly today there are 0 Pullman porters alive, which makes me feel even more obliged to keep the 2 promises that I made to them. One was that I would someday write a book on the favorite sports figure that the Pullman porters carried across the country on their Pullman sleeping cars, and that was a guy named Satchel Paige. And so a couple years ago, I wrote a biography of Satchel Paige, who may have been the best pitcher to ever pick up a baseball. And I just heard some of President Biden's remarks when he was in France, and he was comparing himself, his ancient age, to Satchel Paige, who was ageless. And he was saying that he and the Pope could relate to Satchel Paige. So I did that promise, I kept that promise. The other promise to the Pullman porters was that someday I would write a book on their 3 favorite passengers of all the people they ever carried. And they were 3 guys named Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And there certainly is nobody, there may be nobody in this congregation, live or on Zoom today, who is less qualified to write a book about jazz than me. And there have also been 200 books written on Ellington and Armstrong and Basie. But I'm not trying to write a book about their music. I could not write a book. No matter how much time I took to research it, I'd never know enough about their music to really write a book. What I'm trying to do is write a book about these 3 guys' life off the bandstand, which means how did they travel the country on Pullman sleeping cars, in old jalopies, in beat-up buses? What kind of venues did they play at? And I've spent the last 2 days touring the city of Chicago, trying to understand the venues that they played at. And what I generally have been doing is very smart historians have been taking me to empty lots and saying, this is the venue where they used to play here, because there is at most an edifice left on the building, and generally there's nothing left. I'm trying to understand their home life, and what kind of a home life you could have had if you spent just about every night during the year out on the road. What was their religious life like? What were their side men and side women who played with them? And most importantly, and the centerpiece of my book, is trying to understand whether my thesis holds up, that these 3 guys set the table for the civil rights movement in America, that they played to audiences of whites when no blacks were performing in front of audiences of whites, that many white men across America who would never have let a black man into their house wooed their wives with the music of Louis Armstrong, and they helped, again, create a climate that was favorable to integration by bringing their music to blacks and whites long before Martin Luther King created a civil rights movement. And my guess is, if Martin Luther King were in the congregation with us tonight, that he would say that these three guys wrote the soundtrack for the civil rights movement in America. So one last thing I want to tell you about choosing this topic. Choosing a topic as an author doesn't mean a thing unless you can convince your publisher that the topic that you've chosen is worth their committing substantial amounts of money to publish the book. And I had something going for me. My publisher of my previous book on Joe McCarthy was the top guy at a publishing house that sadly today is defunct, but a month ago was alive and well, called Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. It, like most publishers, has been bought by another publisher, and I'm now publishing a book not for Houghton Mifflin, but for a company called HarperCollins, which bought Houghton Mifflin. But my publisher was sold almost instantaneously on this book, not because he thought I was a great author necessarily, or because he thought it was a brilliant idea, but my publisher is himself a budding jazz pianist who's taking all these lessons, and the idea of doing a book that jived with his personal passion and what he liked to do every night when he went home, he was an easy sell. So it doesn't matter whether America thinks we need the 201st book on Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. It matters the one person who controls the purse strings at your publishing house, and in my case, this guy thought this was a book worth doing. So that's the book I'm trying to write and how I sold and hopefully didn't sell a bill of goods to a publisher. I want to give you a quick sense of some of the things that I've been finding out. I've been away from home for a week now, and I was first in Kansas City, and then I spent the last 3 days in Chicago. And I want to tell you some of the things that I found interesting here that will be some of the things I want to explore for this book. One was the question of why Chicago? Why was Chicago arguably the epicenter of jazz, even more than New Orleans or Kansas City, and certainly more than New York? And it was something that probably anybody with half a brain in this city would have known instantaneously, but maybe lacking that qualification of the half brain or whatever it was, I didn't understand until I came here. And that was that Chicago sits on an extraordinary rail network, and when people were coming from the south, like Louis Armstrong, north, a logical place to end up. You weren't going to end up in New York unless you wanted to spend an extra couple days on the train, and you were never going to end up in Boston, but ending up in Chicago made a whole lot of sense, the same way it did for people who were doing the Great Migration from small southern communities to the north. It made a whole lot of sense for jazz musicians. It also made a lot of sense for the jazz musicians who were doing one-night stands across the Midwest and across the Southwest. These were bands called territory bands. And by the way, everything I say, I'm looking over to a guy here who was my last interview of the day, who teaches the definitive course on the history of jazz at the University of Chicago, and who was one of the smartest. Did I say the University of Chicago? Much better, Northwestern. He teaches it at Northwestern. And who wrote brilliant articles on jazz for the Tribune, for the Wall Street Journal, and for Downbeat Jazz Magazine. John, I'm delighted to see you here, John McDonough. So there were these bands called territory bands that were playing across the Midwest and the Southwest, and they were doing one-night stands, and they were living an exhausting and an incredibly unlucrative lifestyle. And when they could come to this mecca called Chicago and actually spend a week playing at a club there instead of doing these one-night stands, and sleep and eat somewhere decent and spend a week instead of one night, it was an incredibly joyful thing to them. So Chicago, for lots of reasons, it was on a rail line, and it was the biggest place in the Midwest where all these people who were wandering around came and spent time. So I'm intrigued about that reason of what made Chicago a centerpiece of the jazz world. I'm intrigued about guys like Al Capone and the role that the underworld played in making Chicago jazz thrive. They underwrote a lot of the nightclubs where musicians were playing. They wanted musicians to come in, among other reasons, because during the Prohibition era, they were selling their alcohol in speakeasies, they were running brothels on the floor above, and they were probably running a gambling den down below. And what better way to attract people to make more money for these underworld kingpins than by bringing in wonderful jazz musicians that they didn't have to pay a whole lot of money and that would bring crowds of people into their establishments. So I'm intrigued by the whole world of the underworld in jazz. I'm also really interested in the way that the jazz community in a place like Chicago echoed the way that this city became segregated. It was in the strip that was known as the Black Belt, where a lot of the jazz musicians came and where their nightclubs were, and that then became, is it Bronzeville or Brownsville? What is the name that Black Chicago is? It is Brownsville? Right. So I also got a history lesson. There was, and if you weren't aware of it, and I wasn't aware of it, that the city of Chicago has an official historian. It has exactly one historian. It was a man who was the first time that the city ever hired a historian. It is the last time the city will ever hire a historian. And the mayor has let this guy keep his office in the cultural, what did we decide it's called, the Cultural Center? In the cultural, this wonderful building called the Cultural Center. He's actually got a little suite of offices, and he keeps his offices because anytime the mayor of Chicago wants to go into a new neighborhood, she wants to know something about a history of that neighborhood. So this guy gets no salary, but he gets to keep his office, and she gets to ask him all of these questions. And he took me on a 2-hour tour of all the old jazz establishments in the city and helped me understand the way that they echoed a pattern of segregation that developed in Chicago. The first guy that I interviewed when I came from the airport, I took a taxi from O'Hare Airport to 69th and Calumet to interview a guy who I think of as being part of the first family of Chicago jazz. Has anybody ever heard of the Freemans? This guy was George Freeman. His brother was Vaughn Freeman, and there was a third brother whose name I'm forgetting, and there's a nephew named Chico Freeman. And this guy is 94 years old and still actively playing at the Green Mill and other jazz clubs across town. And he helped me understand how drugs and alcohol are also tied up in the whole jazz story. And this guy said that he lived to be 94 and avoided the fate of pals of his like Charlie Parker and the drug addiction because this man's father was a policeman, was a beat cop in Chicago. And Louis Armstrong, when he would do his radio show in Chicago, used to do a shout out to this guy by calling him Officer Black. His name was Freeman, but in Louis Armstrong's wonderful sense of humor, he was Officer Black. And this Officer Black helped keep his 3 sons on a straight and narrow, playing music and drinking a little, but staying away from the drugs that were a temptation. But basically, what I've seen here in Chicago is everything that I was tempted to do in terms of looking at the lives of these jazz musicians, I realize is a story here that came alive and that I got tidbits of this week. And I go back to Boston a whole lot smarter than I came to Chicago. And I want to just say one last thing about the process of writing a book. So you come up with your idea and you sell a bill of goods to your publisher and they agree to publish a book. Then you go out and spend endless time doing all your research. But the real work is sitting down and writing that first word and writing the 300th word of the book. And that's the work that I have left. And what I have to do is go back to Boston and somehow make sense of the fact that I have taken 2,000 pages of notes from the 300 books and tens of thousands of articles that I've read. I've got 2,000 pages of transcripts of interviews with people like John McDonough. And you've got to take 4,000 pages of notes and somehow put those into a form that is a digestible number of pages, which is probably the most any reader could ever be expected to read is 300 or 350 pages. And you've got to say something that nobody has ever said before, and you've got to get it by 5 levels of editors and copy editors, and have a book that they can take out, and no publisher is ever satisfied unless your book resonates in terms of lots of newspaper reviews and being on the radio and being on TV. But what every publisher really wants, and the way you're ensured that they publish your next book, is that you make the New York Times bestseller list. And that is what faces me. I think I actually may stay in Chicago longer than I thought, because the thought is I discuss what I have to do when I go back there. But there is only one reason that you ever write a book. It is not for glory, because there's not a whole lot of glory involved in it. It sure as heck is not for money, because there is very little money involved with it. When I'm in the process of writing a book, I'm up every day at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I keep going until 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and you're never done. Every day you can write 4 pages or you can write 15 pages, but the next day you've got to write another 4 or 15 pages. So there is only one reason you ever write a book, and that is if you are so in love with your topic that you can't not write that book. And I have been in love on 8 previous books with every topic, and I'm more in love with this one. If you spend 3 years calling your work investigating a guy like Joe McCarthy, the idea of being able to hang out for the next 3 years with guys like Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie is an extraordinary joy. So I can't wait to go back. I can't wait to try to write that first word and all the intervening words. And what I would like to do is actually stop talking and see whether people, either who are here in the synagogue with us, or can people ask questions on Zoom as well? Can they ask questions?
Mr. Tye, if you would instruct people to please, if they have them, ask questions in the chat.
So I would like to instruct people to please, if they have them, to ask questions in the chat. And our wonderful multitasker back here, Kenny, who can do everything, will field the questions. And the first question.
Well, I think one of the issues is that just from a tech point of view, in order for the people at home to hear any question, I think we need to use the mic. So we're going to have to pass the mic around, or repeat, or we'll have to repeat the question. Either way. But since I'm holding the mic, I get to ask the first question. And of course, my question might be longer than your whole presentation, I'm not sure. Jazz came out of the African-American experience, out of New Orleans, out of being outsiders in society. There was another group that were outsiders in American society, and those were the Jews. And whether it's in the kind of connection with the music of Benny Goodman and the Gershwins and so forth, or in connection with the record companies or producers. Kenny's doing something? We're okay? So, and let alone Louis Armstrong being completely fluent in Yiddish, which is part of his story as well. How do you see the connection between the Jewish community, both in terms of the musicians, but also the record producers and the club owners? My father was a saloon keeper, so I know that system. I won't tell you what was going on upstairs and downstairs in the basement, but as far as I was concerned, it was just a saloon. So, but music was really very important. So how do those two peoples connect in that way?
So one of the things in every book that I write, I look for some Jewish angle, whether it's there or not there. And in Joe McCarthy's case, it was that in addition to his campaigns that we know against communists and against gays, he was also, I think, a rip-roaring anti-Semite. And went after, even before he launched his campaign against communists, he was defending the perpetrators of the worst Nazi massacre during World War II, the Malmedy massacre. In the case of these three guys, Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, it's a much more upbeat story. And it is, as you said, a story of a shared, I think, suffering, a history of suffering that made them sensitive to the same kinds of music and a sense of also being outsiders that made music, and especially this new form of music called jazz, really appealing to them. And I think that I'm only beginning to discover all the various levels of connections, but I'll tell you just about a couple of them that intrigue me. One is the connection that you alluded to of Louis Armstrong having had one of his earliest jobs working for a family called Karnofsky in New Orleans, who ran a bunch of different kinds of businesses, but essentially had a junk business, a schmutty business. And Louis Armstrong, before he was old enough to get a job anywhere else, worked for them, worked on their wagon, helping deliver coal and other goods to the neighborhood called Storyville. He was fascinated by the family. They would give him probably the best meal that he had during the week. When they would take him home at night afterwards, he would hear Mrs. Karnofsky sing a lullaby, a Russian lullaby to her kids, and he was incredibly moved by that. And Louis Armstrong wrote a couple formal biographies during his life, but near the end of his life, he wrote a biography dedicated to the Jewish family Karnofsky, and it was a really moving document. And he wore around his neck for all of his life a Star of David, which was, depending on which version of the story Louis Armstrong was telling, and he always had 5 versions, it was essentially in honor of the Karnofskys. So I love that story. There are stories that each of my 3 maestros, at some point during their lives, and often for much of their professional lives, had Jewish managers. And that was a relationship that was at times warm, at times less warm. But in Louis Armstrong's case, there was a Chicago guy named Joe Glazer who was his manager for the bulk of his career. And while there are people who swear to me that Louis Armstrong had mixed feelings about Joe Glazer, anything he ever said publicly was calling Joe Glazer his brother or his father or whatever it was. They died within weeks of one another in New York, and Louis Armstrong had said that he always wanted to predecease Joe Glazer. Joe Glazer, he didn't realize when Louis was in the hospital, was dying in a different floor of the same hospital. But they had an extraordinarily close relationship. But I'm also intrigued about the Jews' role in Chicago, maybe more than anywhere, in terms of the mob. And they had various underworld connections, and nobody better exemplified that than Joe Glazer, who was the son of a prominent doctor and managed one of his earliest scams in life was a scam with other doctors where he perpetrated this thing that, depending on which version of the Chicago Tribune story you did, almost got him sent away to the pen. He almost got sent away to the pen for about 10 other offenses, and every time I think I've exhausted all the old Tribune clips on just how nefarious Joe Glazer was, somebody comes up with a few more. But he was some combination of enabler of a lot of black musicians who would never have gotten the chance that they did if he wasn't around, and a mob guy. And I think that and to me, any story only becomes credible when you see a light side and a dark side to it. And the roles of Jews in jazz, like the roles of blacks in jazz, has both light and dark sides. And I'm intrigued by that. And I'm intrigued, I guess, by the idea that there was once in America this brilliant black-Jewish alliance. It was one of the underpinnings, as you all know, of the civil rights movement, and it was Jews who were the strongest supporters of Martin Luther King and all kinds of other civil rights leaders. And I think in the precursor to that, there was this black-Jewish alliance in the world of jazz that is musically brilliant and a really human story that makes you want to cry at times. In the Any questions here? Ma'am?
Take this down. I have actually two questions, but related to one topic, and that is the travel topic for these three people. Because when you started to speak, I was hearkening back to the Green Book, the movie The Green Book, so I'd like to know a little bit about what you know about them and these other people that had to travel and possibly stay in specific places. And second, about the Pullman car. Was there an issue, race issue for them traveling in the nice sleeping cars?
So, good questions. And John, if I get anything wrong, you can intervene and correct me here. So the issue of Pullman porters, so everybody knows from the movie The Green Book that there was this book that told people who were black and traveling across America where they could safely go. Well, before there was such a thing as the Green Book, there was such a thing as the Pullman porters. And there was no black man in America who traveled the country more and who knew better the places that you could get into real trouble in the Jim Crow South or in the Jim Crow, informal Jim Crow North than the Pullman porters, because they had gotten into trouble in all those places. By trying to go into the wrong hotel or restaurant, it was something that could get you beat up or killed. And the three men that I'm writing about understood, they all traveled extensively in the Deep South, and they all knew just how dangerous that was. And they went there because there were a lot of good opportunities to play and to earn money, and booking agents like Joe Glazer sent Louis Armstrong there. But especially Armstrong, who had grown up in New Orleans, he understood the pitfalls. So when they earned enough money, and this was, for all of them, they were successful enough at what they did, that the safest way to travel in the Jim Crow South was to rent a Pullman sleeping car, which wasn't cheap. But what that meant was you could take the car if you were doing a 7-day stint in Atlanta, and you'd go south below the Mason-Dixon line, and instead of having to ride in this horrible Jim Crow car, which was the one that was noisiest and smokiest, you were in this elegant Pullman sleeping car. And at night, instead of worrying whether you were going to find a hotel or a restaurant or even a bathroom that you could use, and these guys were often told in the same clubs that they were playing in that they had to enter through the kitchen and that they couldn't stop and eat there, and they sure as heck couldn't sleep in the hotels that they were playing in. So what better way to ensure you had somewhere elegant to sleep and eat and use the bathroom than in the Pullman sleeping car? So you take that Pullman car to Atlanta, they'd pull the car off the tracks, and it would sit there on the side tracks for the week that you were there. At night you went back and slept there, you went back and ate there, and you had these extraordinary guys who were Pullman porters who adored you, and they were going to take care of you at day and night whenever you were on their sleeping car. And it was expensive, but it was worth it, and you could come out alive, and they wouldn't have done it if it hadn't worked financially, but they also all stayed alive at a time when a lot of blacks who had similar experiences didn't. So that was a long-winded answer, but
The heyday for all three was in the 30s and 40s with the big band era. How did they get along with their Jewish competition, Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, and several others, since they were all competing for the same venues?
So what I know of that, and there's a whole lot about that that I don't know, and hopefully I will by the time I write the book, but what I know about that is that what they would write in terms of their memoirs and their official versions of the stories were they all got along great, and Benny Goodman brought a lot of Count Basie's went to Carnegie Hall, and people, there was a lot of interaction. The truth is that Benny Goodman was called the King of Swing, and Count Basie believed he was the King of Swing. And he believed that Kansas City music was, by definition, swing music, and that was its innovation in jazz. And again, the professor here teaches a course that talks about where swing really came from, so if I get it wrong, you'll let me know. But I think that there was, Benny Goodman was also a cantankerous enough guy that it was difficult not to have, feel his sharp elbows. So how did they get along with a lot of very prominent Jewish musicians? The answer is incredibly well, and that their bands, all of their bands were among the earliest to integrate. And generally, when you looked at who the white members of the bands were, there were always one or two Jewish members. Benny Goodman was a special case, and I think that how did Benny Goodman get along with most white musicians and most of his relatives and most of his friends? The answer was, it depended what day. And he was brilliant at a million things, but getting along with people wasn't his strong suit, I would say. Anything you want to add?
You're from Boston?
I am.
Okay, I'm from New York. Hi, everybody. What makes Chicago really special, you know, with this topic, and it's fascinating, your premise, I think is the blues. I think it makes it different. And I think Maxwell Street, I'm trying to help you with your research. Is that something you've looked at? Because when I was lucky enough that Maxwell Street was still around when I moved to Chicago like 28 years ago, and you would hear jazz, you would hear blues, and you would hear klezmer music, and it was so cool. Like just so wild and foreign, but so Chicago at the same time. So just curious if that's part of your research and part of the writings for your book.
So it is, I'm trying to, again, steer clear to whatever extent I can from, you can't write about three musicians and not talk about music and not know the answer to questions like you're asking, but I'm also trying to steer clear of saying too much about their music, partly because I'm not smart enough to say interesting things about it, but there is so much to tell in this off-the-bandstand story, and I'm interested in these guys as human beings, but I think what made Chicago special was blues, but it was also jazz, and it was that Chicago did it in a way that I think of as being more interesting than New York. Eventually, New York takes over everything, including in the baseball world, where you and I have got to pick at some point, but I think that Chicago there was a reason why, in addition to just being more conveniently along the train line, that people like Louis Armstrong and before him King Oliver and others came to Chicago and not to New York in the early years, and that I think this was a more swinging place, a bluesier place, and a jazzier place, and I think that that I will get in trouble with a lot of people in New York until I really understand it better by saying this, but I think that it would have been more interesting if I were a jazz musician or a jazz writer in those days. I would have rather been in Chicago than in New York. And also, Chicago has, to me, as an outsider who doesn't really know anything about the city, and you may tell me I'm really wrong, but Chicago to me is a blend of all the bigness and diversity that New York has, with a city like Boston that has real neighborhoods. And by definition, neighborhoods are the kind of place that musicians like to play and like to feel they're part of a neighborhood. And I think that what I've seen of my touring of the New York jazz world, and I've got a lot more, when I leave here, where I'm going to go after I go back and show my face for a while in Boston, is to New York to try to understand better the world. And people, when you're writing a book during a pandemic, it offers opportunities and challenges. The challenge is it's a pandemic, and you can't go out and visit jazz clubs because they're closed and because it wouldn't be safe to be there. The opportunity is there are people in the New York jazz world who I would have spent a year chasing down, like Wynton Marsalis and John Batiste, and people who are generally, in the normal course of the world, very busy. Well, during a pandemic, they, like everyone else, are stuck at home. And after spending a while trying to reach Wynton Marsalis, he told me, call anytime, day or night. And John Batiste said the same thing. And it wasn't that they liked me, it's that they were stuck home with nothing to do, and I was somebody to talk to on the telephone. And so I'm going back to New York to see the reawakening world of jazz there. I'm going to a place in New Jersey called Red Bank, which is where Count Basie came from, to try to see what other than Count Basie made Red Bank interesting, and why Count Basie took off as soon as he could to New York and then to Kansas City and didn't hang out in Red Bank. But one of the ways you understand people like I'm writing about is going to where they came from. And I had read a million things by and about Louis Armstrong, but until I spent a week in New Orleans, I didn't understand Louis Armstrong. And spending time there, it infuses you. If you go around and look around and you have the people you're interviewing drive you around town and show you things, you come away with this inspired sense. So I'm going to leave Chicago thinking I know a whole lot more about it than I do, but I know a lot more about it than I would have just by reading books about Chicago jazz.
More a comment. Okay, just a comment. One other thing Chicago had special in the 40s and 50s was it was the center of the radio and the recording industry. And that was another reason people liked to come to Chicago. I grew up in New York, and I knew the Cap family of Cap Records and stuff, but I think it really all started here in Chicago, and my dad was part of that scene.
So I think you're absolutely right, but the question is which came first in a way, the chicken or the egg in terms of this, and there were obviously a lot of recording industry in New York as well, and I think Chicago, and I'll probably say exactly the opposite when I speak at a synagogue in New York, but I think Chicago was more interesting in terms of all of that. So I want to just say one last thing, and that thing is that you've got to make sure, I understand that your extraordinary rabbi is in the process of working towards retirement, and for selfish reasons, because I can't imagine coming to Chicago and not seeing Rabbi Gordon here at your wonderful shul, and for your reasons, you've got to make sure this is a gradual thing. I know that you have this amazing series of speakers that are welcoming his eventual retirement, but I can't imagine there not being a Rabbi Sam Gordon at Sukkot Shalom, and so I just want to thank him for this book and for every book being my friend.
And thank you for your continuing friendship to me, to this congregation, especially. We have this series of guest speakers. Larry just happened to be around and became the grace note in this series. And so, as always, Larry, you bring so much insight to us, and you're really a joy. And we will continue to follow your writing and the books that you produce. So thank you. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's wonderful to have all of you here. Shabbat Shalom to those of you who are online as well. Shabbat Shalom.